handful of times through what is now something of a behemoth of a piece, I've described Star Wars, both in terms of the original film under discussion primarily and the franchise, as subversive. And it occurs to me that word gets misused and misunderstood an awful lot. It doesn't necessarily have to mean revolutionary or carry some kind of self-critical affectation. It merely means, when applied to a work of art, that the work under consideration calls into question, challenges, or otherwise goes against the grain of convention. The place of Star Wars in popular culture is often misapplied, deliberately so, to be part of a return to traditionalism, a reassertion of the cultural status quo after the tumult of the 60s and 70s.
What a shrill, pointless decade.
I imagine the preceding segments of this piece have done their part to dispel this in the broader sense, i.e. how the franchise began and remained very much a part of the counterculture despite later attempts to claim it by reactionary forces in the 80s and onward. Suffice it to say, no, the movie about a cobbled-together rebel army of college-age, shaggy-haired kids bringing down cosmic fascism with the power of space Buddhism was not on the right flank of anything. In the timeline of 20th century film history, Star Wars is typically positioned as part of the birth of the blockbuster moment that marked the end of the experimental 70s and the rebirth of the studio system, and as such tends to be paired alongside Spielberg's Jaws as a 1-2 punch of big-budget reworkings of formerly juvenile genre fare of the type that would come to dominate multiplexes thereafter.
Smile, you son of a bitch.
But there's a competing view of that era, one I'm increasingly given to subscribe to, that takes a broader view wherein the blockbuster has a more organic rise that actually begins with the unexpectedly massive ticket sales for the youth-targeted love story during Robert Evans' tenure as the head of Paramount, which helped lead to his production of The Godfather, which in turn established Coppola, whose influence begets Lucas, Spielberg, so on and so forth. And viewed apart from the biases of or against genre film, both Jaws and Star Wars have at least as much in common with The Godfather as they do with each other. All three represent boomer filmmakers following their interpretations of the Edicts of Auteur theory by taking disreputable genre material of the past, sci-fi serials, monster movies, gangster movies, and reworking them on a grand operatic scale attuned to the idiosyncrasies of the auteur filmmakers themselves. Coppola's sweeping humanism, Spielberg's precision-timed grasp of film language, and Lucas, well, to be honest, I think that more than anything, what Lucas gifted to Star Wars was that George Lucas, he is a thoroughly non-mainstream person, or at least as non-mainstream as a suburban white kid from Southern California at film school in the 70s could be under the circumstances. When you look at things like his original drafts for Star Wars and every version of THX 1138, it's almost startling how much closer he seems in filmmaking sensibility to David Lynch or John Borman, an esoteric weirdo who approaches narrative in terms of rhyming story beats and tone poems, attempts environmental storytelling with wholly artificial environments, and seems to regard conceiving the emotional reactions of made-up alien creatures and actual humans like himself as equally difficult screenplay challenges. How strange that this is where Star Wars, the widely beloved, incredibly accessible, all-ages, most marketable movie franchise of all time came from, until, as you're doing here, we go back and watch just the first one in isolation and recognize that part of what blew people's minds open for all of the stuff to pour in and colonize the imaginations of a generation is that this was a really new, different, bizarre movie. In fact, it's probably the most aesthetically different of the Star Wars films apart from Rogue One, and the most narratively subversive until... oh.
Are you alright? What's wrong?
I felt a great disturbance in the Force.
The final version of this piece will not be making a lot of reference to The Last Jedi or really any of the other Star Wars movies, TV things, cartoons, comics, novels, games, whatever the hell they're doing for Disney+. Not a thing we're getting into, at least that's the plan. But given that this is a separate preview thing comprised of expanded, unedited portions of the two segments from the larger piece focused on a single, not unrelated issue, I thought the context would be appropriate, particularly in terms of why get into this now.
It offered something you needed, and you didn't even try to stop yourself.
You know, one of the things that's somewhat slowed my hand in video production for YouTube over the last year, I mean, other than doing 3 shows weekly for The Escapist and Geek.com, is that I've really come to dislike the way the material, like what I produce, though not so much what I produce, because if you've been paying attention, I try to make these not really all that usable for those purposes, because I generally don't like those purposes, gets used in place of making arguments online, either the I'll just leave this here factor, or the way people will take away a single mimetic point and build an entire presumed understanding of a given piece of popular culture around it. Now, frankly, The Last Jedi is not the most prominent or even really the most frustrating case of it. It's just the one that's relevant right here and right now. But to the point, just about every insufferable thing on every side of modern movie discussion begins and ends with the fact that we've got a solid decade or more now of people whose yearly film-going diet is every Marvel movie, every DC movie, a cartoon if it's Pixar or Lego, and adaptations of toys from the 80s or video games if they release any, and maybe 3 or 4 other big-ish blockbusters in between those, and that's it, thinking of themselves as big film buffs because they spend the intervening weeks and months reading clickbait about the production of that relatively limited slate of films. Oh, and some of them also make time to jerk off to Japanese cartoons.
The elf wenches are so beautiful, you'll spend the rest of your life searching for that same beauty again. Yes. Wow. You're an idiot.
In other words, we've got an anti-intellectual epidemic on our hands of people who want to think of themselves as being into movie when they're really only into a handful of things that are currently popular as source material for movies, which in and of itself isn't really a problem or any kind of big deal. You can think of yourself as whatever you want, honestly, but since they're on the internet and or social media, they also want to engage in arguments about what they think they're fans of vis-a-vis films, filmmaking, with people who do know the subject and go looking for smart-sounding arguments to back up what tend to be not terribly sturdy arguments from a debating film side because, you know, they don't actually have a true well of knowledge to draw on, which in turn is how you end up with the popular standardization of talking points that sound smart if you're stupid. Not necessarily because the argument you're making, but because of the poor chain of logic you're using to get there.
Impressive. Every word in that sentence was wrong.
The most prevalent of these regarding The Last Jedi, then, is that the film is overpraised by critics for the way it subverts expectations because it undertakes that subversion either without having any point or in defiance of Star Wars' more straightforward storytelling tradition. Basically, you don't really like it because it's good, you just like it because it's different. Frustratingly, it's easy to see how the logic in that makes sense. People who see a lot of movies see the same cliches play out over and over more often than more casual viewers, therefore they get bored with them more easily and are thus susceptible to being dazzled by something that breaks up routine even if it's not broken up in a positive way.
Good morning, Peter. I made your favorite breakfast.
The hell is this?
French toast. I just made a few creative changes to the recipe. I think it's a lot better now.
Lois, if this is your idea of a joke, you must write for Leno.
The problem is, that doesn't really tend to be how it works. Speaking anecdotally from my own experience, it's the people who have a more shallow pool of references to draw from who are more apt to view this or that work as overly similar because of the lack of a broad spectrum for grasping nuance. To the critical mind, experiencing similar but not identical motifs repeatedly ideally trains one to recognize and appreciate subtle differences, not begrudge obvious similarity. That said, as concerns The Last Jedi, speaking only for myself, firstly, I never really thought of it as being that overly subversive of a thing to begin with. It's certainly a more conventionally paced and structured Star Wars movie than, say, Rogue One was, but more to the point, to the degree that it was different and did subvert my expectations vis-a-vis where things seemed to be heading after The Force Awakens, the reason I was glad for that was because it meant it was doing what a Star Wars movie was supposed to do. As much as I did like The Force Awakens, a lot of the setup, or at least what seemed like setup for things to come, felt like kind of rote, obvious even. You can totally get why people looked at Snoke and figured, well, there must be a secret there, or that Rey must be someone important's daughter, because that's how things would play out in a typical by-the-numbers piece of genre fiction. But Star Wars, the Star Wars movies, I once again stress, generally don't go by the numbers.
Who is this? What's your operating number?
Boring conversation anyway.
Star Wars doesn't do typical. Star Wars does the other thing, the different thing. Star Wars has the Jedi Master turn out to be a goofy Muppet. Star Wars has Leia be Luke's secret twin. Star Wars spends most of Act 1 being a weird comedy with two robots bumbling around in the desert and goes, no, fucking figure out what's going on for yourself. Star Wars has the Empire be defeated by Native American teddy bears. So when the second part of the new trilogy opted to pay off most of the seeming setups from the first part in the form of, well, that didn't go where I was expecting, hell yeah, I was glad, because it felt like Star Wars. The original Star Wars feels very much like a 70s movie with the deliberately paced first act, heavy reliance on conversational pitch, ADR dialogue, and zoomed-in cinematography, a grainier overall shooting stock, more naturalistic exterior scenes, especially on Tatooine, and that whole general Great American Hangover vibe that permeated the 70s in general, but also because it is, in spite of all the compromises he's reputed to have made, a George Lucas movie. Infused with the same hazy, dreamlike spirit and willingness to flaunt the rules of cinematic structure, even while adhering to mythic structure that was present in THX's Nightmare Dystopia and American Graffiti's half-remembered deluge of fevered teenage nostalgia. Think about how the opening shots of the ships cruising overhead aims to throw the audience off guard by distorting our sense of physical space, how we're dropped in media res into a shootout with almost no context as to who's killing who, save for a title crawl that pretends like we're supposed to know what happened beforehand. Then when the camera framing finally shows us a character we're apparently meant to share a viewpoint with, it's this weird gold robot creature who's even more confused about what the hell is going on than we are.
R2-D2, where are you?
And then we find his buddy, even more robot-y looking robot, to ask him to clarify the situation.
Where have you been? They're heading in this direction. What are we going to do? We'll be sent to the spice mines of Kessel or smashed into who knows what. Wait a minute.
Oh great, he speaks a robot language we don't get to understand. I mean, imagine it's opening night and you're watching this as someone who hadn't previously been marinating the weirder quarters of the sci-fi genre up to this point, which is actually a more substantive portion of the audience than we conventionally think of, but we'll get to that later. You're probably a bit lost here, right? As in, honey, are you following this? I thought this was a space movie we were going to see, but one of the astronauts is a princess for some reason, and now we're here with these two robots looking for skibbity-boobity somebody?
What's your middle name?
Scooby-Dooby.
Ooby-doob, Scooby-Dooby, Banooby?
One and the same.
and one of them just makes beeping sounds. Is this a kid's movie? Because it seems like it's a kid's movie, but a bunch of guys just got shot, and I think the black helmet man just killed a guy.
If this is a consular ship, where is the ambassador?
So, are the robots the main people, I guess? Oh, wait, okay, now there's these guys. I guess they'll explain what's going on. Oh, okay. So how much of this movie is going to be robots and Muppets making weird noises at each other? Because this is a lot weirder than I thought. Oh, okay, a blonde kid. All right, this must be the main guy. Huh, wow, that seemed to take a while.
Luke, tell Uncle if he gets a translator, be sure it speaks Vachi.
Doesn't look like we have much of a choice, but I'll remind him.
Yeah, go ahead and mark it. Luke Skywalker does not enter Star Wars at all until about 15 minutes into the film. That's how long it takes the main character of all 3 original films to show up without any indication that we're supposed to be waiting for him unless you saw the trailer. He's not in the title crawl, he's not mentioned prior to this, we're not told he's an important guy because he's not, they haven't made that part up yet. He's not even who the 2 robots were here to find in the first place. You just kind of have to take it from the soundtrack cue when Luke goes out to look at the twin sunsets after he's all, Uncle Owen, I want to answer the call to adventure. And Uncle Owen is all, you can answer the call to adventure when your chores are done, rah. All on the same page with the scenario here. Oh, okay, it's a movie about a kid on a farm who wants to go fly planes in the war, like a Red Baron type movie. Okay, now I got a handle on this. But it takes a comparatively long way around to getting you there, and it doesn't stop messing with the narrative rules, even within its own genre. Now, I know we're trying as best we can not to call ahead to the other movies, but there really is no better way to explain this. You know how the fandom is still melting down because in the last...
Objection! Sustained!
When Rey finally hands Luke Anakin's lightsaber and he just goes like... And okay, that's meant to be unexpected there, deliberate subversion of tropes, etc., whatever. Well, when was the last time you went back and watched the scene where Luke first gets that lightsaber from Obi-Wan in the first place, which is also the first time we've ever seen a lightsaber in the history of motion pictures?
Not as clumsy or random as a blaster. An elegant weapon for a more civilized age. For over 1,000 generations, the Jedi Knights were the guardians of peace and justice in the Old Republic. Before the Dark Times. Before the Empire.
Yeah, that's it. The old guy takes it out of a box and hands it to him like no big deal, and Luke Skywalker lights up what might be the single greatest practical contribution of Star Wars to the genre itself, the most badass science fiction weapon of all time, and he just kind of twirls it around a few times like, oh hey, this is different, and then he puts it away and they go right back into the backstory exposition.
How did my father die?
This is a boy seemingly of common birth being entrusted with a token symbolizing the noble warrior heritage of his father by a wizard. This is Merlin, Arthur, Sword in the Stone, and or Excalibur.
What is it?
Your father's lightsaber. This is the weapon of a Jedi Knight.
The metaphor is unmistakable. It's obviously a big deal. Even without the mythic allegory, it's the introduction of a signature totemic weapon. The tradition of cinematic language generally denotes that those should get a close-up, an establishing shot, or at least their own music cue. But not in Star Wars, at least not at this point in Star Wars, where it still feels very much like a film of the late 70s rather than of the early 80s, and a wizard is just some kind of weird, blissed-out mystic living in a hut, thank you JR, which, again, is all the more impressive when you remember that however big and elaborate this initial esoteric concept was, Lucas was still pretty much making this stuff up as he went along.
No, my father didn't fight in the wars. He was a navigator on a spice freighter.
That's what your uncle told you. He didn't hold with your father's ideals, thought he should have stayed here and not gotten involved.
The audience is so profoundly lost amid the sheer alienness of what's all around them from the moment Star Wars begins that the film can exploit their instinct to grasp at anything familiar as narrative shorthand, and all that weirdness with the spaceships and Vaders and droids and Jawas and sandcrawlers. The fact that we're able to immediately identify Luke and his relatives as some kind of farmers is familiar enough that everything about them and their surroundings feels like a safe, grounded homestead without having to spend too much time establishing it. Speaking of familiarity, no sooner does the audience finally seem to have been given a tangible grasp of where we are, what's going on, and who to root for, i.e. we've got a rough sketch of the villain's plan and a broader power structure.
The rebellion will continue to gain support in the Imperial Senate.
The Imperial Senate will no longer be of any concern to us. I have just received word that the Emperor has dissolved the Council permanently. The last remnants of the old Republic have been swept away.
We've got a theoretically relatable protagonist, a mentor figure to provide mythos, backstory, and context, some dead people to avenge to get the old stakes raised. Everything gets super alien and otherworldly again because we drop Luke and company into the cantina scene, and oh my god, what the hell is even happening? The movie turned all freaking weird again. Now this does serve to keep the audience on its toes and reinforce that this is a big strange universe and something bizarre is always potentially right around the corner, but the subtle fact that we are completely adrift in this place, Luke is only mostly out of place, and Obi-Wan rolls in like a boss, doubly reinforces that there's a distinct layer of unreality separating us from even these supposedly relatable protagonists.
Hey, we don't serve their kind here.
What?
Every movie, every single one, has themes, mainly because every narrative has themes, and almost all films are narrative films, and even those that are not still have themes, because even the most abstract film imaginable is still made up of visuals, and every visual communicates its own mini-narrative, also known as an idea. That doesn't mean that every film is trying to send a message, or several messages, or that every message is whatever this or that political commentator, editorialist, philosopher, academic, or person on YouTube pretending to be any combination of those things says it is. It simply means that 1. All stories are about things. 2. Most stories are about more than just the events that they describe. 3. Star Wars is a story about more than the events it describes. That more is what we call themes. There's one theme that hangs over the whole franchise, but probably the original more so than others, and may well have had more to do with how Star Wars broke out and why people didn't necessarily see it coming. Want a hint? Well, it's subtle, but they did put it in the title.
War. It's fantastic.